This story is titled, "When I secretly arrived at the party, I saw my fiancée dancing with another man, so I immediately took off the ring, gave it to her friend, and disappeared without a trace." Sup Reddit, my name is Dylan, and I'm 29 years old. Looking back now, I should have known that morning was different from the moment I opened my eyes. There was this strange energy in the air, a kind of static that seemed to hum just beneath your skin, like something was about to tip over and shatter everything you thought you knew about your life. I woke up first, like I always do. The house was completely quiet, wrapped in that heavy silence that only comes in the early hours before the world starts moving again. Chloe was still wrapped in the sheets on her side of the bed. Her hair spilled across the pillow like it hadn't seen a brush in days. She looked beautiful, but there was something cold about her even in sleep, distant in a way that had become all too familiar. I found myself watching her for a second longer than I should have, studying her face for some sign of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But she felt like a stranger lying there, someone I shared a bed with but no longer really knew. Eventually, I gave up and got out of bed, padding downstairs to start another day that would probably feel exactly like the last dozen. I made tea alone again, and that was becoming the norm in our house. The ritual that used to be ours had slowly become just mine. The tea didn't taste like much even though it was the same brand I'd always bought. Nothing did lately. Everything seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on my entire life. I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through news I didn't care about, trying to distract myself from the urge to check her messages. I didn't even want to look, but I had to. It was like scratching a wound to see if it still bled. This compulsive need to confirm what I already suspected but didn't want to face. She was out of bed by the time I got out of the shower, standing in front of the bathroom mirror wrapped in a towel. She moved around me like I didn't even exist, like I was just another piece of furniture she had to navigate around. When she finally spoke, she said she had appointments that day, doctor, dentist, something vague and dismissive. She said it with that same voice she'd been using for the past few months, the one she saved for people she didn't plan on listening to. It was emotionally sterile, completely devoid of warmth. She could smile with her teeth, but never with her eyes anymore. That disconnect had become her default setting, and I was starting to realize it wasn't temporary. That afternoon, we had to be at her cousin Brittany's wedding, and Chloe was in the bridal party. This meant I was stuck playing the role of the supportive husband while she floated around in that burgundy dress, pretending not to hate everyone around her. She used to tell me everything she hated about these family events: the fake conversations, the forced smiles, the relatives who asked invasive questions. Now she just wore her disdain like a mask, keeping it all bottled up inside where I couldn't reach it. The drive to the venue was painfully quiet. She was glued to her phone the entire time, her thumbs moving across the screen with an urgency that seemed too fast to be casual conversation. I could see her reflection in the passenger window, completely absorbed in whatever conversation was demanding all her attention. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Who are you texting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and conversational. Without missing a beat, she replied, "Mia, my sister." The words came out smooth and practiced, like she'd rehearsed them. That was the first lie of the day. Not the first lie ever. God knows there had been others. But it was the first one I caught that particular day. The thing is, I knew it wasn't Mia she was texting. I knew because I'd spoken to Mia myself just that morning, and she'd told me she was catching a plane to Atlanta for a work conference. Her flight was scheduled to leave around the same time Chloe was supposedly having this lengthy text conversation with her. Chloe didn't know that I'd talked to her sister. She had no idea that her carefully constructed lie had such an obvious hole in it. I just sat there, watching her continue typing away, and filed this information away in the growing catalog of deceptions I'd been collecting. I wasn't scared anymore. That phase had passed months ago. Now I was just gathering evidence, building a case for my own sanity. When someone makes you doubt your own instincts for so long, when they gaslight you into questioning every suspicion and concern you have, you start craving concrete proof like oxygen. You need something solid to hold on to, something that confirms you're not losing your mind. This lie about Mia, small as it was, felt like a piece of that proof. At the wedding, I watched Chloe all night, but not because I didn't trust her. I'd already stopped trusting her months ago. That ship had sailed long before we even got dressed for this event. No, I watched because I was finally done pretending not to see what was happening right in front of me. I was tired of making excuses, tired of giving her the benefit of the doubt when she'd stopped deserving it. The way she looked for him before she even took her seat told me everything I needed to know. Her eyes swept the room with purpose, searching for someone specific, and when she found him, her smile stretched in a way I hadn't seen in months. It was genuine, unguarded, the kind of smile she used to give me. Blake, the gym buddy, the one I'd met exactly once, briefly and awkwardly. He was tall, smug, and heavy on cologne. The kind of guy who wore too much expensive fragrance to mask his insecurities. When he grinned, he showed too many teeth, like a predator sizing up his prey. Everything about him screamed overcompensation, but Chloe seemed drawn to that artificial confidence like a moth to a flame. When he walked over to greet her, he hugged her like they shared something sacred, something intimate that went far beyond casual friendship. His arms lingered around her waist, and she melted into him with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. He didn't even acknowledge me this time, didn't extend his hand for a shake or offer a polite nod. It was like I simply didn't exist in their world. Chloe didn't introduce us either. She didn't even look at me when he approached, completely absorbed in whatever bubble they'd created together. I stood there like a piece of background scenery, watching my wife interact with another man like I was invisible. I played along because what else could I do? I sat through the endless speeches about love and commitment, choking down dry salmon that tasted like cardboard. I drank just enough wine to feel brave, but not enough to do something stupid. The whole time, I watched her float across the dance floor like she was already someone else's wife, like she'd checked out of our marriage completely and was just going through the motions until she could make her escape official. Then, during the last slow song of the night, it happened. The moment that shattered any remaining illusions I'd been clinging to. She stepped into Blake's arms like it was muscle memory, like they'd done this dance 100 times before. There was nothing awkward or hesitant about it, just pure, comfortable familiarity. Her hand went to the back of his neck automatically, fingers curling into his hair with an intimacy that hit me like a physical blow. His hand rested on her hip, pulling her closer, and their foreheads touched briefly as they swayed to the music. She laughed at something he whispered in her ear, a genuine, delighted sound that I realized I hadn't heard from her in months. Her fingers curled into his jacket, holding him close like she never wanted to let him go. It was intimate in a way that went far beyond friendship, far beyond anything she could explain away later. That was it. That was the moment when everything crystallized, when all the lies and suspicions and half-truths finally formed a complete picture I could no longer deny. I stood up from our table, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I walked over to where she'd left her clutch and pulled out the ring I'd taken off hours earlier. The ring I'd been holding onto like it was a dying organ, like letting go of it would mean accepting that everything was over. I didn't look back at her. I didn't need to see her face or try to read her expression. I'd seen enough. Instead, I handed the ring to Mia, who had somehow shown up after all, despite supposedly being in Atlanta. Her face told me everything I needed to know, a mixture of pity, guilt, and anger that confirmed she'd known what was happening all along. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing left to say. Then I walked out. Out of the wedding hall, out of the illusion I'd been living in, out of 5 years of slow rot that I'd been trying to patch up with duct tape and denial. And that was how it ended. Not with yelling, not with a dramatic confrontation or thrown accusations. It ended with a dance, her dance with another man, while I finally found the courage to walk away. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't face the thought of walking into our apartment, seeing her things scattered around, breathing the same air she'd been breathing while lying to my face for months. Instead, I drove with no destination in mind, just letting my headlights cut through the dark country roads that stretched endlessly ahead of me. The wedding music was still ringing in my ears like a ghost I couldn't shake. Every time I tried to focus on the road ahead, I'd hear that slow song again, see her melting into Blake's arms like she belonged there. The image was burned into my retinas, playing on repeat no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I passed the same gas station twice during my aimless wandering. The second time I realized I hadn't even stopped for gas the first time around. I'd just been circling like a lost dog that didn't know where to lay down. My mind was operating on autopilot, while my emotions crashed around inside me like debris in a hurricane. The phone stayed dark on the passenger seat, silent and accusatory. She didn't call, not once. Not even a single text message asking where I'd gone or what I meant by handing her sister my wedding ring like some kind of quiet bomb. That silence hit me harder than if she had screamed at me, harder than if she'd blown up my phone with frantic apologies and explanations. The fact that she didn't even try to reach out told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her priorities. Chloe had become something completely unrecognizable, so far gone from the woman I'd married that she didn't even pretend to care anymore. Maybe she thought I wouldn't actually leave. Maybe she thought I didn't have the backbone to walk away from 5 years of shared history. Maybe she thought I was too comfortable, too settled, too afraid of starting over to actually follow through on my threats. Around 1:30 in the morning, I finally pulled into a grocery store parking lot and just sat there in the car for another hour. The fluorescent lights from the 24-hour store cast everything in a harsh, artificial glow that made the whole scene feel surreal, like I was living inside someone else's nightmare. I kept thinking about all the things I'd missed, all the red flags I'd brushed off or explained away because I wanted so desperately to believe everything was fine. The way she'd started locking her phone months ago, guarding it like state secrets. How she would physically flinch when I walked into a room while she was texting, like I'd caught her doing something shameful. The new lingerie that appeared in our dresser, expensive, beautiful pieces that I never saw her wear for me. The sudden solo gym sessions that always seemed to run late, stretching what should have been an hour workout into 3 or 4 hours of unexplained absence. When I'd ask why she was so late, she'd laugh in this defensive way that made me feel like I was being paranoid for even questioning her. The pieces weren't just falling into place now, they were punching me in the gut one by one. Each memory a fresh confirmation of how thoroughly I'd been played. Blake wasn't some fantasy or momentary lapse in judgment. He wasn't a mistake she'd made in a moment of weakness. He was the person she'd chosen when she decided I wasn't enough anymore, and she'd been choosing him over me for longer than I wanted to calculate. At 3:12 in the morning, I finally opened my phone. The screen lit up my face in the darkness of the car, and I saw 4 unread messages from Chloe. All of them had been sent between midnight and 1 a.m., and the timestamps were clustered close together, like she'd been typing furiously and then second-guessing every word before hitting send. The first message was simple. "Where did you go?" No question mark, no punctuation, just a flat demand for information. The second came 20 minutes later. "Can we talk?" Again, no question mark. It wasn't really a request, it was more like a command disguised as concern. The third message, sent just 15 minutes after that. "I know what you think you saw, but it's not like that." This one made me laugh out loud in the empty parking lot, a bitter sound that echoed off the car windows. Classic Chloe, already trying to rewrite reality before we'd even had the conversation. But it was the fourth and final message that really got to me. "This isn't fair, you're making a scene." I stared at that last one for a long time, reading it over and over until the words lost all meaning. Making a scene. She dances with another man like I never existed, pressing her body against his in front of our friends and family. And I'm the one making a scene because I walked away without a word. I hadn't yelled, hadn't caused a disruption, hadn't even confronted them directly. I'd simply removed myself from a situation that had become unbearable. That message right there, that was Chloe in a nutshell. She had this incredible ability to flip any situation to make herself the victim, to take any reasonable response to her behavior and twist it into evidence of my inadequacy. In her mind, I was the problem for reacting to her betrayal, not her for betraying me in the first place. Chloe didn't lie with panic or desperation like most people do when they're caught. She lied with this calm, smooth coldness that was almost clinical in its precision. Her lies were polished like expensive furniture. She never had to dust herself. Perfect, pristine, and completely artificial. I didn't reply to any of the messages. I wouldn't, not yet. I wasn't ready to engage with her version of reality, where somehow I was the unreasonable one for having feelings about watching my wife in another man's arms. Instead, I started the car and drove back toward the city. Back to the apartment where we'd been living like roommates for months without either of us having the courage to acknowledge it. I sat in the parking lot again, with the engine running, keys ready in my hand, staring up at our third-floor window. Her light was on. She was awake, probably pacing around the living room, maybe crying, maybe rehearsing the lines she'd use when I finally came home. She was waiting for me to come back so she could deploy whatever strategy she'd settled on. Tears, anger, or the cold, logical explanations that made me feel crazy for having emotions about anything. I didn't go inside. I couldn't face her yet, couldn't trust myself to have that conversation when I was still this raw and angry. Instead, I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go and closed my eyes. I slept in the car that night, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed to feel what it was like to choose distance over comfort. I needed to experience what it felt like to prioritize my own emotional safety over the familiar routine of pretending everything was fine. And it felt like the first honest decision I'd made in years. By morning, my neck ached from the angle I'd slumped into against the car window, and my mouth was dry as if I'd swallowed the whole night in one bitter gulp. The sun was just dragging itself over the buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. When I sat up and looked again at our apartment window, the light was still on. She hadn't slept either, which was good. I wanted her to feel some fraction of the restless agony I'd been carrying around for months, wondering where I stood in her life while she made her choices behind my back. I got out of the car, locked it with a hollow electronic beep that seemed too loud in the morning quiet, and walked toward the building. Every step felt heavy, weighed down by everything I didn't want to say, but knew I had to. The weight of all those unspoken truths pressed against my spine like a physical burden I'd been carrying for too long. I wasn't sure if I was going upstairs to fight or to leave for good. I just knew I had to face her, had to look her in the eye and see what was left of the woman I'd thought I'd married. The apartment door creaked when I opened it, the same familiar sound it had made every day for the past 3 years. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, barefoot, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup was wiped clean but not completely ruined. She looked raw and tired but not devastated. Not like someone whose world had just fallen apart. She looked up when she saw me, and her first words were exactly what I'd expected, delivered in that flat, emotionless tone I'd grown to despise. "You're being dramatic. No apology. No panic. No acknowledgement of what had happened or why I might be upset. Just that blank, surgical dismissal that she'd perfected over the months of our relationship's slow decay." Chloe always had this incredible ability to remove herself emotionally from any scene and act like she was just an innocent bystander watching someone else's drama unfold. I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and leaned against the counter. The cold water helped clear some of the fog from my head, but it did nothing for the rage building in my chest. "You gave your ring to my sister," she added, like this was somehow the most unreasonable part of the entire situation. "You were dancing with him," I replied quietly. "It was one dance, Dylan." The way she said my name made it sound like an accusation, like I was being childish for caring about what I'd witnessed. "Then why are you lying about it?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. She'd been ready for a confrontation, prepared for me to come home angry and emotional so she could play the role of the reasonable one trying to calm down her irrational husband. But she wasn't ready for that particular question, wasn't prepared for me to challenge the foundation of her carefully constructed narrative. She stood up slowly and deliberately, crossing the living room like she was rehearsing a scene in a movie, every movement calculated for maximum effect. "I'm not lying," she said. But there was something hollow in her voice, like she was reading lines she didn't quite believe herself. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, scrolled to her messages from the night before, and tossed it to her. The screen was open to the conversation she'd sworn was with Mia, the sister who was supposedly in Atlanta during the exact time they were supposedly texting. "Mia was in Atlanta. Want to keep lying?" She stared at the phone screen, and for the first time since I'd walked in, she didn't have an immediate response. Her face twitched once, a tiny crack in the mask she'd been wearing for months. Then she said it, the sentence I'll never forget as long as I live, delivered with surgical precision designed to cut me down at the knees. "You're overreacting. You're just insecure because you've let yourself go." It wasn't just a lie. It was a calculated attack, a verbal missile aimed directly at every insecurity she knew I had about myself. It landed exactly where she intended it to, hitting me right in the chest and spreading through my body like poison. I stood there for a moment, my pulse hammering in my ears, my stomach turning to ice as her words sank in. Every part of me was screaming to respond, to lash out, to give her back some of the pain she'd just inflicted on me. But I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything or storm out or give her the dramatic reaction she was probably expecting. Instead, I just breathed in so deep it hurt my chest and asked the one question that mattered. "How long?" She looked away from me then, unable to maintain eye contact. The mask was starting to slip and she knew it. "How long, Chloe?" I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a pause that stretched between us like a chasm, and then she answered with a voice as flat and dead as water. "Does it matter?" It mattered. It mattered more than anything else in the world at that moment. Not because of the number of days or nights or hours she'd been betraying me, but because of what that number represented. The sheer scope of her disrespect, the calculated nature of her deception, the ease with which she'd been living this double life. "You lied to me," I said, my voice getting quieter as the full weight of everything hit me. "You turned me into a fool." You kept me in this house, in this marriage, while I couldn't even finish the sentence. The words felt too big, too devastating to say out loud. That's when she snapped, her composure finally cracking as she stepped toward me with fire in her eyes. While I tried to feel something again, you think this was easy for me? Do you even hear yourself lately? You act like a ghost, Dylan, like a roommate who forgot how to smile. I laughed then, a quiet, bitter sound that surprised us both. So that's your excuse? I didn't make you feel special enough, so you decided to spread your comfort around? Her jaw clenched, and for the first time in months, I could see real emotion flickering across her face. But she didn't answer my question. She couldn't, because we both knew there was no justification for what she'd done. I gave you everything, I said, my voice softer now, not because I was feeling calm, but because I was completely cracked open. Time, loyalty, years of myself. I put my soul into this relationship, Chloe, and you gave me routine. She whispered something then, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. Not a soul. Routine. And that was it. That was the moment when I knew she was truly gone. Not just physically or emotionally, but on some fundamental molecular level. Chloe had evolved into someone else entirely. Someone who couldn't recognize love unless it came packaged with fireworks and chaos and constant drama. The quiet, steady devotion I'd offered her for 5 years? The daily choice to build something together? The small acts of care and consideration that make up a real partnership? None of that registered as love in her new reality. She needed excitement, validation, the thrill of something forbidden and new. And I was just collateral damage in her journey of self-discovery. I left without saying another word. There was nothing left to say. No argument that could bridge the gap between who we'd become. I walked past her into our bedroom and started filling a duffel bag with clothes. Just the essentials, not everything, not yet. This wasn't about what I could carry in one trip. It was about what I was willing to leave behind. She stood in the doorway watching me pack, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes completely dry. No tears, no pleas for me to stay, no last-minute attempts to salvage what we'd built together. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a dramatic exit or the ammunition to tell people later that I'd lost control. But I did take the keys to the apartment with me, because if she wanted to unlock new doors in her life, she'd damn well have to find her own way to do it. I stayed with my friend Kevin for the next 3 nights, and I have to give him credit. He handled the situation with exactly the kind of grace I needed. He didn't ask questions that first evening when I showed up at his door with a duffel bag and the hollow look of someone whose world had just imploded. He just tossed me a blanket, a pillow, and a beer, then left me alone in his guest room to process whatever I was ready to process. I appreciated that silence more than he'll ever know. The last thing I needed was someone trying to fix me or offering platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. Kevin understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who's drowning is just throw them a life preserver and let them figure out how to use it. On the second night, I broke completely. It was something stupid that triggered it. Just a glimpse of Chloe's face in a photo on my phone. One I hadn't had the courage to delete yet. We were at a beach somewhere, maybe a year ago, back when things still felt salvageable. Her hair was windblown and wild, and I was squinting at the sun, grinning like an idiot, leaning into her like she was the only thing keeping me warm. I remember thinking at the time that this was my forever. This woman. This moment. This feeling of complete contentment. I thought I'd found my person, the one I'd grow old with. I was so sure of us back then. So confident that whatever rough patch we were going through was just temporary turbulence on our way to something better. I dropped the phone and it hit the carpet without making a sound. I sat there on the edge of Kevin's guest bed, my shoulders shaking, but the tears wouldn't come. It wasn't sadness anymore. That would have been easier to handle. This was something sharper, something that crawled under my skin and made me want to crawl out of my own body just to get away from the feeling. It was the realization that I'd been living in a fantasy for months, maybe years. That the woman I'd been fighting for, making excuses for, trying so desperately to reconnect with, she didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. On the third night, Kevin finally spoke up. He'd been giving me space, but I guess even his patience had limits. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, settling into the couch across from where I was staring at the ceiling. "No. You should. I don't want to talk about it. You handed your ring to her sister at a wedding and walked out, man. That's not something you walk away from without saying something." I kept staring at the ceiling, counting the little imperfections in the paint. She lied. "Yeah, She lied for a long time and I let her. I knew she was lying. I think I knew from the first time she said his name. I paused, letting the weight of that admission settle. Blake. Kevin leaned back on the couch and whistled low. What a prick. It's not even about him, I muttered, finally looking away from the ceiling to meet his eyes. It's her. The way she did it. The way she looked at me while she was in his arms, like she was daring me to say something. Like she wanted me to snap so she could blame me for making it real, instead of just letting her live in this gray area where she could have both of us. The silence that followed was long and thick and heavy, the kind that settles over a room when someone finally says the thing everyone's been thinking, but no one wants to acknowledge. Then Kevin asked the question no one had dared to voice yet. Do you still love her? I didn't answer immediately. I just closed my eyes and tried to figure out if what I was feeling could still be called love, or if it was something else entirely, grief maybe, for the person I thought she was. Because the truth was worse than a simple yes or no. The truth was that I wasn't sure anymore if what I'd been feeling could even be called love, or if it was something else entirely, some toxic mixture of habit, hope, and stubborn refusal to accept reality. I loved the version of Chloe I thought I had. The woman who used to laugh into my neck when we watched movies together, who used to cook with me barefoot in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, who once wrote a note on a Post-it and stuck it to my coffee mug that said, "Your morning tea smile is my favorite part of the day." That woman was gone. Maybe she'd never existed in the first place. Maybe I'd been so desperate to believe in us that I'd created this idealized version of her in my mind, filling in the gaps with wishful thinking and selective memory. All I could think about was how I hadn't seen it sooner. How the hell had I managed to sleep next to a stranger for this long? How had I missed all the signs, ignored all the red flags, made excuses for behavior that should have been deal breakers from the start? Later that night, my phone rang. Not Chloe. I would have ignored her call anyway. It was Mia, her sister, and her voice was quiet and careful when I answered. "She's saying you're the one who left her," Mia said without preamble. "That you were distant first. That you shut down and stopped trying." Of course she was. Chloe had always been masterful at rewriting history to make herself the victim. She could take any situation and spin it until she came out looking like the wronged party, no matter what she'd actually done. "Did she tell you she's been seeing Blake for months?" I asked. Mia hesitated, and I could hear the conflict in that pause. "She denied it, but Dylan, I saw them that night after you left. I stayed behind to help clean up the reception hall." My stomach dropped. And he kissed her, right there in front of everyone who was still around. She didn't even flinch, didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. Just smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world and kept dancing with him. I didn't breathe for a moment. Hearing it confirmed out loud, having someone else witness what I'd suspected, somehow made it both better and infinitely worse. "Dylan, I don't think she's sorry," Mia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, she's upset that you left, but I don't think she regrets what she did. Does that make sense?" "I know," I whispered back. "That's the part that kills me. She's not sorry she did it. She's just sorry she got caught." I hung up then, my hand shaking as I set the phone down on Kevin's coffee table. I lay there staring at the ceiling again, but this time something had shifted in my understanding of the whole situation. I hadn't lost Chloe in some tragic, unavoidable way. I hadn't failed to fight hard enough for our relationship or missed some crucial opportunity to save what we had. The truth was much simpler and somehow more devastating. I had just finally seen her clearly for who she really was. The woman I'd been mourning. The relationship I'd been trying so desperately to save. None of it had been real for a long time. I'd been clinging to a ghost, fighting for something that had already died months ago. I just hadn't been ready to acknowledge it until I watched her dance with another man like I didn't exist. The day I went back to the apartment wasn't planned. I didn't tell Kevin where I was going, didn't call ahead to see if Chloe would be there. I just woke up that morning, put on the same hoodie I'd been wearing for days. It was starting to smell like defeat and sleepless nights, and drove there like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life. I still had my key, and I wasn't sure if she'd changed the locks yet. Part of me almost hoped she had, because that would have made the decision easier. But when I slid the key into the lock, it turned with the same soft click it always had, and the door opened to reveal the apartment that used to be ours. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was different, vanilla, and something artificial, like those expensive candles she'd started buying from boutique stores. It smelled like she'd been trying to scrub me out of the space, to erase any trace of the life we'd built together within these walls. Maybe she had. The furniture had been moved slightly. The couch was angled differently, the rug had been shifted, and there was a new throw pillow sitting where I used to keep my weekend hoodie. It was still recognizably her place, but it wasn't mine anymore. She'd already started the process of rewriting our shared space to fit her new reality. Chloe was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she didn't jump or gasp or fumble with whatever she was doing. She just turned around slowly, spoon in hand, stirring something in a pot on the stove like I was simply getting home from work on any ordinary day. "Didn't expect you," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. I figured that much was obvious, but I didn't say anything. She didn't ask why I'd come or what I wanted. She just leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. That's when I noticed she was wearing my sweatshirt, the gray one with the university logo that I hadn't seen in months. She'd been hiding it from me, keeping it for herself while slowly pushing me out of every other aspect of her life. "Don't you want your things?" she asked, like this was just a practical matter that needed to be resolved. "Some," I replied. She watched me like I was some kind of dangerous animal in a cage, something unpredictable that might lash out at any moment. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Kevin told me you're staying with him," she said. I hadn't told Kevin to share that information, and Kevin wouldn't have volunteered it to her. That meant Mia had told her, which meant the family gossip network was already buzzing with news of our separation. "He's a good friend," she added, and there was something sharp in her voice like she was testing me. "You wouldn't know what that looks like," I shot back before I could stop myself. That landed. I saw it in the way her jaw twitched, the way her fingers gripped tighter around her arms. For a split second, the mask slipped and I caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath. Maybe guilt, maybe regret, maybe just anger at being called out. "I never meant for it to go this way," she said quietly. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You did." "Don't do that!" she snapped, stepping forward now, her composure cracking. "Don't act like I planned this whole thing, like I wanted to destroy what we had." "But you did destroy it," I said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since I'd walked in. "You knew what Blake was to you. You let it happen. You looked me in the eye and lied to me every single day. Don't act like this just spiraled out of control. Don't pretend this was some accident." She paused then, and when she spoke again, it was in the smallest voice I'd ever heard from her. "I was lonely. I was sitting next to you every single night," I said. "You just stopped seeing me." And then, for the first time in months, something inside her cracked completely open. She started crying. Not the loud, dramatic sobs I might have expected, but slow, tired tears that slid down her face as she turned away from me and leaned over the sink, gripping the edges like they were the only things keeping her upright. "I thought if I just kept it quiet," she said, her voice breaking. "If I just got through it somehow, I could fix everything before you found out." I stared at her shaking shoulders, feeling a mixture of anger and something that might have been pity. "So you were going to fix it by sleeping with someone else behind my back?" "It wasn't just that," she said, turning back to face me with tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was how he made me feel. Like I mattered, like someone actually wanted to know what I was thinking." I nodded slowly, letting that sink in. "I did that for years, Chloe." "You stopped," she whispered. "You pulled away first," I said, and I could feel my own composure starting to fracture. "And when I asked what was wrong, you smiled and said you were fine. You said I was imagining things. You made me feel like I was going crazy for even questioning what was happening between us." Her shoulders shook harder, and she didn't try to defend herself after that. There was nothing she could say, no argument she could make that would justify what she'd done to us, to me, to herself. I walked past her into the bedroom and started filling a duffel bag with more clothes. Just the essentials still. Not everything. Not yet. This wasn't about what I could physically carry in one trip. It was about what I was emotionally ready to leave behind. What pieces of our shared life I was prepared to sever myself from permanently. She stood in the doorway watching me pack, her eyes red and swollen, her arms hanging limp at her sides like she'd finally run out of fight. "You're really not coming back," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that she was finally accepting. I turned to look at her one last time, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no love, no regret, just a vast, empty space where all those complicated emotions used to live. "No," I said quietly. "I already left. You just didn't notice." I zipped up the duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked past her toward the front door. She didn't try to stop me, didn't make any last-minute pleas or promises. She just stood there in the bedroom doorway, watching me leave our life behind like she was observing something happening to someone else. The door closed behind me with the same soft sound it had made thousands of times before. But this time it felt final. This time, I knew I wouldn't be coming back to try again. Wouldn't be making excuses for her behavior or hoping things would magically get better. I was done fighting for someone who had stopped fighting for us a long time ago. The days that followed were a blur of small, painful routines that somehow added up to the beginning of a new life. I found an apartment not far from where Kevin lived, but far enough from everything Chloe had touched that I wouldn't wake up to the memory of her voice or catch a glimpse of her shadow through the window. I needed distance, physical, emotional, psychological distance from every reminder of what we'd been. I spent hours moving boxes and unpacking, trying to make this new place feel like something I could call home instead of just a place where I slept and ate and waited for the pain to subside. I painted walls, changed light bulbs, arranged furniture, bought new sheets that didn't smell like her perfume. But no matter how many changes I made to the physical space, I could still feel the ghost of her presence in every corner. It was like she'd left invisible fingerprints on my soul, and no amount of redecorating could scrub them away. Then came the calls. Chloe's voice on the phone was a constantly shifting mix of anger, regret, and something else I wasn't ready to name. Maybe desperation, maybe manipulation, maybe genuine remorse. It was impossible to tell with her anymore. "I made a mistake," she said one afternoon, her words tumbling out in a rush like she'd been rehearsing them. "I want to come back. I want us to try again." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there in my new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, trying to figure out if any part of me wanted to believe her. "I'm serious," she pressed when the silence stretched too long. "I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just let me fix this." There was another silence on my end, because the truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to fix anything anymore. I'd spent so much energy trying to repair what was broken between us that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself, instead of just wanting to save us. "Why should I believe you?" I finally asked. She sighed, and I could picture her running her hand through her hair the way she always did when she was frustrated. "Because I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of lying. Tired of being someone I hate." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I thought about all the nights she'd told me she was fine, while I lay awake, wondering where she really was. I thought about the way she'd looked at me in those final months, like I was already gone even when she was still physically in the room with me. "I don't know if I can trust you," I said honestly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want to try. I want us to try." I hung up then, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. It felt like the floor had shifted beneath me, like everything I thought I'd figured out about moving on had suddenly become uncertain again. I wanted to believe her. God help me. I wanted to believe that there was still something worth saving between us. But something inside me had broken during those months of lies and gaslighting, and I wasn't sure it could be repaired with good intentions and promises of change. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, or even the lies. The hardest part was realizing that sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap between who people used to be and who they've become. Sometimes caring about someone means accepting that they're not capable of being the person you need them to be, no matter how much you both might want it to work. Weeks passed with Chloe's calls and texts coming in waves, sometimes desperate and pleading, sometimes cold and accusatory. She tried to explain everything in fragments, piecing together a narrative that might make sense of what had happened between us. How she'd felt invisible in our relationship. How Blake was just a symptom of something deeper that was broken. How she'd never wanted to hurt me, but didn't know how to stop the momentum once it had started. I listened to it all, not because I believed every word she said, but because I needed to hear it. I needed to understand what had happened to the woman I thought I knew. How she'd transformed from someone who used to leave love notes on my coffee mug into someone who could lie to my face for months without flinching. One afternoon, I agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe downtown. No grand gestures, no promises of reconciliation. Just two people trying to navigate through the wreckage of something that neither of us had wanted to destroy. But both of us were trapped inside. She arrived late, looking like she'd barely slept in weeks. Her eyes were rimmed red with exhaustion, but she was trying to mask it with carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the toll this was taking on her. Her smile was shaky and forced, the kind you wear when you're trying to convince yourself as much as the other person that everything might still be okay. "I'm sorry," she said before I could even get a word out. "For everything. For all of it." I nodded. sipping black coffee that tasted as bitter as the knot forming in my stomach. The cafe was nearly empty, filled with the kind of artificial quiet that comes from people trying not to eavesdrop on conversations that are clearly too important for public spaces. "Do you want to know the truth?" she asked, after we'd sat in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes. I leaned back in my chair, bracing myself for whatever revelation was coming next. "I wasn't just lonely," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. Scared of who I was becoming in our relationship. Scared that you were slipping away from me and I didn't know how to hold on. Scared of being alone with myself." "So you ran," I said. It wasn't a question. She swallowed hard, her composure starting to crack. "I didn't mean for it to be like this. I thought if I could find a piece of myself outside of us, maybe I could come back to you whole. Maybe I could figure out how to be the person you needed me to be." "But you didn't come back." "No," she whispered. "I didn't." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she'd ruined everything we'd built together for a fantasy that was never going to make her happy. But instead, I just listened. Because beneath all the lies and betrayal and manipulation, I could see a woman who was breaking apart just like me, just in a different way. We talked for hours about mistakes and regrets and the impossible task of forgiveness when trust has been shattered beyond repair. When I finally left that cafe, I didn't feel closure or hope or any of the things I thought I might feel after hearing her side of the story. I just felt the heavy weight of knowing that some things can never be undone, no matter how much both people might want to find their way back to each other. And for the first time, I understood that sometimes love means letting go, even when it kills you to do it. After that cafe meeting, everything shifted in a way I hadn't expected. But it wasn't the kind of shift that brings resolution or peace. It was something much more unsettling. Chloe stopped calling. No more late-night apologies delivered through voicemails I was too tired to listen to. No more frantic text messages trying to explain away the unexplainable. Just complete, deafening silence. At first, I thought it was relief. Maybe she'd finally accepted that what we'd had was truly over. That no amount of explanation or pleading was going to bridge the gap between us. Maybe she'd found some kind of peace with the ending and decided to let both of us move on with our lives. But then came the quiet dread, creeping in during the empty spaces between work and sleep. It was the crushing realization that the person I'd loved for 5 years was no longer fighting for me, no longer trying to find a way back to what we'd built together. The silence felt heavier than all her desperate attempts at reconciliation combined. Days turned into weeks, and I buried myself in anything that would keep my mind occupied. Work became my sanctuary. Spreadsheets and deadlines and conference calls that demanded enough attention to crowd out the thoughts I didn't want to face. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected during the worst months of my relationship, rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned when everything became about trying to fix what was broken between Chloe and me. One evening, I found myself doing something I'd promised myself I'd never do again, scrolling through her social media. It was like picking at a scab that hadn't healed yet, this compulsive need to see what her life looked like without me in it. And there she was, smiling and laughing with Blake in photos that felt like punches to the gut. Their bodies were pressed close together, hands intertwined like they'd been together for years instead of months. Their eyes were shining with the kind of happiness I thought had been ours, the kind of joy I remembered from our early days when everything felt possible and the future stretched out ahead of us like an endless summer. The anger flared up inside me like a wildfire. How could she move on so fast? How could she erase everything we'd had together with a few filtered photos and carefully crafted captions? How could she replace 5 years of shared history with this new narrative where she was the happy, liberated woman who'd finally found her true love? I wanted to scream at the screen, to comment on every photo with the truth about who she really was. A liar, a manipulator, someone who destroyed something beautiful because she was too selfish to do the hard work of honest communication. But instead, I closed the app and swallowed the lump in my throat that tasted like bile and broken dreams. Because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, about the part of myself I'd lost while chasing the ghost of a marriage that hadn't been real for longer than I wanted to admit. I'd spent so much energy trying to save something that was already dead that I'd forgotten what it felt like to live for myself instead of living in reaction to someone else's choices. I realized then that I needed to stop waiting for apologies that weren't coming, waiting for her to change into someone she'd never been willing to be, waiting for the Chloe I'd fallen in love with to magically reappear and explain that this had all been some terrible mistake. I needed to start living for myself again. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and paper, something I hadn't done in years, and wrote my own version of goodbye. Not to her, but to the years I'd spent hoping things would get better when all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. I wrote to the version of myself who'd made excuses for behavior that should have been unforgivable, who'd twisted himself into knots, trying to be enough for someone who'd already decided he wasn't. It wasn't a letter I'd ever send to anyone. It was just me, finally acknowledging what I'd been too afraid to admit for months, that I deserved better than someone who could look me in the eye while betraying everything we'd built together. For the first time in a long time, I felt something that might have been freedom. Starting over wasn't easy, though. I wasn't the same man who'd handed his wedding ring to her sister at that wedding and walked out into the night. But I wasn't fully healed either. Healing, I was learning, wasn't a destination you arrived at, but a process you had to choose every single day. Every day was a mixture of progress and setback, like climbing a hill that never seemed to end, but occasionally offered glimpses of what lay beyond the summit. Some nights I'd lie awake replaying the moments I wished I could change. Her lies, the way she'd looked at me while betraying everything we'd built, the coldness in her voice when I'd finally confronted her with the truth. The bitterness still tasted like ash in my mouth when I let myself dwell on it too long. But other times, I found glimpses of myself again. The person I'd been before I'd lost myself in the exhausting work of trying to save a relationship that one person had already abandoned. I went back to the things I'd stopped doing during the worst months. The morning runs that used to clear my head, old books that had been gathering dust on my nightstand, late-night phone calls with friends I'd pushed away when everything became about managing Chloe's moods and trying to decode her increasingly distant behavior. I started learning what it meant to be alone without feeling empty, to enjoy my own company without constantly wondering what was wrong with me that someone I'd loved could treat me with such casual cruelty. Chloe tried reaching out again once or twice over the following weeks. Her messages were polite and careful, like she was testing the waters to see if I'd softened enough to engage with her again. But I didn't respond. Not because I was still angry, though part of me was, but because I was finally done waiting for her to become someone she wasn't willing to be. I also realized something else during those quiet weeks of rebuilding. Forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about letting yourself move forward without dragging the past behind you like a chain wrapped around your ankle. Sometimes forgiveness means accepting that someone showed you exactly who they were, believing them, and choosing not to let their choices define your worth. So I did something I'd never thought I'd be capable of. I let go. Not because I'd forgotten what she'd done to us, and not because the hurt had magically disappeared, but because I finally understood that my worth wasn't tied to her approval or her betrayal. I was starting to see the shape of something new in my life, something stronger than what I'd had before, built on truth instead of lies, on self-respect instead of desperate hope, on reality instead of the fantasy I'd been clinging to for so long. It's been almost a year since I handed that ring to Mia and walked out of the wedding hall, leaving behind everything I thought I knew about love and commitment and the person I'd planned to spend my life with. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about Chloe, but not the woman she became in those final months. Not the cold, calculating stranger who could lie to my face while planning her escape. I think about the woman I loved, or thought I did. Before everything fell apart, the memories come uninvited like echoes in a quiet room, sudden flashes of better times that feel like they happened to someone else entirely. But they don't sting the way they used to. The sharp edges of those memories have been worn smooth by time and the hard work of rebuilding myself from the ground up. I've learned a brutal truth through all of this. Love can be messy and painful and unforgiving, but betrayal is always a choice. When someone chooses to break you without regret, when they make a conscious decision to prioritize their own desires over your shared commitment, no amount of hope or determination or blind faith can fix that fundamental breach of trust. Chloe wasn't just dishonest with me. She was cold and calculating in her deception. She dismissed my feelings like they were inconveniences to be managed rather than valid responses to her behavior. She twisted every conversation to make herself the victim, rewriting our history to justify choices that had no justification. She didn't just cheat on me. She systematically dismantled everything I'd given her, everything I'd believed we were building together. And she did it with a level of emotional detachment that still takes my breath away when I think about it too directly. But here's the thing I've discovered about surviving something like this. I did survive. Not because I'm particularly strong or brave or resilient, but because I finally stopped letting her define who I was and what I was worth. I won't pretend the hurt is completely gone. It's still there, a quiet scar beneath my skin that occasionally aches when the weather changes or when I'm caught off guard by a song we used to listen to together. But it doesn't control me anymore. It doesn't dictate my choices or my mood or my ability to believe that I deserve better than what she was willing to give me. To anyone out there feeling like I did during those dark months, lost, betrayed, broken, questioning your own sanity and worth, I want you to know this. You deserve the truth from the people you love. Not sugar-coated lies designed to spare feelings, not convenient half-truths that allow someone to have their cake and eat it too, not gaslighting disguised as concern for your emotional stability. You deserve respect, loyalty, and a love that lifts you up instead of slowly tearing you down through 1,000 small cruelties and casual betrayals. You deserve someone who chooses you every day, not someone who treats your relationship like a safety net while they explore other options. And if you find yourself standing in a room, watching the person you trusted most dance with someone else like you don't exist, don't wait for them to explain it away. Don't pretend you didn't see what you saw. Don't let anyone convince you that your reasonable response to unreasonable behavior makes you the problem. Walk away. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hand over the ring and refuse to look back. Refuse to participate in your own diminishment. Refuse to accept scraps of affection from someone who's giving their best to someone else. That night when I walked out of the wedding hall, I wasn't just leaving her behind. I was walking away from 5 years of making excuses for someone who had stopped making any effort to deserve them. I was leaving behind the version of myself who had twisted into knots trying to be enough for someone who had already decided I wasn't worth fighting for. But more than anything else, I was starting over. And that decision, that single moment of choosing my own dignity over the comfortable familiarity of a broken relationship, that's the only thing about this entire nightmare that I'll ever be grateful for. Starting over meant learning to trust my instincts again after months of being told they were wrong. It meant rediscovering what it felt like to wake up without immediately wondering what mood she'd be in or what version of the truth I'd get that day. It meant remembering that love shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells around someone who's supposed to be your safe harbor. It meant accepting that some people will show you exactly who they are if you're brave enough to stop making excuses for them and start believing the evidence of your own eyes. Chloe showed me who she was in that final dance with Blake. She showed me in the months of lies that preceded it. She showed me in the cold, clinical way she dismissed my pain when I finally confronted her. She showed me in her complete inability to take responsibility for her choices without simultaneously making herself the victim of circumstances beyond her control. And yes, she was a total scoundrel. She lied effortlessly, dismissed my feelings like they were inconveniences, and twisted every conversation to make herself look like the wronged party. She didn't just cheat on me, she systematically eroded my ability to trust my own judgment while she lived a double life that required me to be either blind or complicit. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then. I survived her. Not just the betrayal, but the gaslighting, the manipulation, the months of being made to feel like I was losing my mind for noticing that the person I loved was slowly disappearing and being replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I won't pretend the hurt is gone completely. It's still there, a quiet reminder beneath my skin that some scars never fully fade. But it doesn't control me anymore. It doesn't dictate my choices or my ability to believe that I deserve better than what she was willing to give. To anyone out there feeling like I did, lost, betrayed, questioning everything you thought you knew about the person sleeping next to you, know this. You deserve the truth. You deserve respect. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to ignore your instincts or make excuses for behavior that makes you feel small. And if you find yourself standing in a room watching the person you trusted most treat you like you're invisible while they give their attention to someone else, don't wait for permission to protect yourself. Don't stay hoping they'll remember who you used to be to them. Walk away. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hand over the ring, refuse to look back, and choose the uncertain future over the familiar pain of a present that's slowly killing your spirit. That night when I walked out, I wasn't just leaving her. I was finally, after months of trying to save something that was already dead, choosing myself. And that choice, that single moment of refusing to accept scraps of love from someone who was giving their best to someone else, that was the moment my real life began.